So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sarah. I work at the EADI Secretariat in Bonn, Germany. We're delighted to welcome you to the presentation of one of our new volumes in the EADI Global Development Series titled Civil Society Responses to Changing Civic Spaces. You're just going to hear about the book in the course of the event, so I will use this opportunity to give a brief introduction to EADI and the book series. If you aren't familiar with us, EADI is the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, and we work on improving the visibility of development studies throughout Europe and promoting cooperation between our members across countries. We host events of different types, so if you would like to keep abreast of them, you can take a look at our events calendar at eadi.org. The EADI Global Development Series has been around for a while now. I believe the first book came out around 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. And the series has since spanned a wide range of topics from development aid to urban poverty, social research and policy, through to development studies, to name a few. And that's in accordance with its aim to broaden our understanding of the processes that influence human development from a variety of perspectives. We have had 2 books published in the series this year, so this one on civic spaces and one on decoloniality and justice, both open access and both faring very well with thousands of downloads. So that's quite, that's been brilliant. And the Building Development Studies for the New Millennium volume in the series has several blog posts on the EADI development blog. So do check that out, also linked via our website. And that's it for me. With great anticipation, I will hand things over to Tiina to start the presentation. Tiina, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for introducing EADI. And I will warmly welcome everyone on behalf of the editorial team of the book. So my name is Tiina, Kontinen, an Associate Professor in International Development Studies at the University of Jyväskylä and co-convener of EADI Working Group of Civil Society and Citizenship Development, which we are co-convening with the editorial team. And this book is actually a result of number of conference panels and workshops that we have conducted over past years with that working group. Okay. Now we can go maybe to the program. I will just go quickly through the program for today. So we will have a quick overview of the book first by my co-editors, after which we will have 4 presentations from chapter authors. And I will briefly introduce each author before the presentation. So there's kind of introduction to them. And after all the presentations, we will have an invited commentary from Professor Cheeseman, which I already joined us. Welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation to give you critical comments on the book. And after the invited comments, we will have question and answer session. So I would encourage everyone to use the chat function to post your questions, and then we can discuss at the end of the session. We will hope to have around half an hour for the discussion in the end. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my brilliant co-conveners and co-editors who will present an overview of the book. Marianne Millstein is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Urban and Regional Research, Oslo Metropolitan University from Norway. And she has published on urban politics, governance and planning, civil society and citizenship, and so on and so forth. And she has been the co-convener of this working group from the very, very beginning. And she will first introduce the kind of introduction to the book, and after that, Kees Biekart, who is an associate professor at the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in the Netherlands, will tell you more about the conclusions and maybe the kind of future implications of the book. Kees focuses on social movements, NGOs, civil society, civic-driven change, and participatory action research. And just to mention that together with Alan Fowler, they recently edited a volume, a research agenda for civil society, which is also an open access book you can find with Edward Elgar Publishing. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Marianne to give us the introduction to the book, and then immediately after that, Kees will continue with the conclusions. Please.
Thank you, Tiina, and thank you everyone for coming on Tuesday afternoon. I'm going to try to just briefly set out some of our kind of starting points and initial theoretical framings and discussions that kind of frames this project. I think that is an important starting point is this general discussions around the kind of democratic decline or democratic backslashes that has been increasingly monitored and evaluated through notions such as civic space. And I think that when we started this project a few years back, I think our initial discussions really emerged about the concept of civic space in itself, like where it emerges from, what it can and cannot help us see, and the way that we kind of monitor and evaluate these certain kinds of democratic institutional changes. So I think that while for us as a starting point, while we obviously are kind of seeing and identifying these varying trends in terms of democratic decline, turns to autocratization, the kind of rise of more populist forces, both through state regimes, but also within civil society itself. We felt this need to perhaps contribute with a more nuanced and more contextual understanding of what is actually at stake. So we wanted to kind of take both the idea of civic space and see how it was being treated within development studies and how kind of civil society and the variety of civil society strategies and practices are responding in different ways to these changes. So I will just briefly go through some of the key arguments that we make in the introduction. And one of them is for us to try to place our project and our objective, which is kind of this need to nuance the conceptual and analytical understanding about these dynamics between civic space and civil society, within some broader global trends within development and development policies and studies and research. Obviously, you make certain selections when you do these kinds of introductory projects. But firstly, we discuss one of the broader trends in terms of this move from the optimism of the 1990s towards this now worrying third wave of autocratization that someone has described it. That is not only a phenomenon in newer democracies, but something that we also see in older democracies around the world. So although a lot of our focus is on the global south, this is very much a global phenomenon. The other kind of trend and debate we'll try to engage with is how the idea of civic space has been inserted into development policies and development discourses, and this kind of interlocution between the use of civic space and civil society, where sometimes they are conflated in a way as spaces of actions, although we in our project insist on having them analytically distinct and kind of see civic space more as an kind of enabling environment for civil society strategies and practices. The third trend is this kind of also part of our starting point, this monitoring and attempts to evaluate the global trends and changes in civic space, in particular around the notion of shrinking. So we go through some of the literature and discussions, not only in the policies, but also in terms of the research, and some of the things that is important for us as a kind of an inspiration as well, I think, for our project is that while there's definitely shrinking civic spaces for certain civil society actors, we can also talk more about changing rather than necessarily shrinking civic spaces, in the sense that while it may open opportunities or close opportunities for some certain kinds of actors, it also opens up spaces of actions for other kinds of civil society organizations. So we see this kind of shift, in particular in the kind of research literature on civic space, towards an emphasis on changing rather than shrinking civic spaces. The important thing for us in terms of this debate about monitoring is not to dismiss it or kind of abandon these ideas, rather to have a more critical look at the discourses and underpinning trajectories of thinking that also underlies the idea of civic space. So in terms of how the contribution we make and when the kind of perspectives that we do have a discussions both around the idea of civil society and about civic space. And I just want to emphasize a few points. One is discussions around the idea of civil society. And this discussions around having a more critical understanding of the diversity of civil society strategies and practices. And this kind of interrelations between civil society and the state. And it opens up for a more relational understanding of the dynamics between the diversity of experiences that civil society actors have in responding to these changing civic spaces, or this changing room of maneuver that they have in different contexts. I also think it's important for us to emphasize, partially as a filling a blind spot or a gap in the research and discussions around the changing civic spaces, is to have a much better understanding of the contextual dynamics of the various experiences that we see. And not only from the more formal, larger civil society organizations, but also coming through more everyday local community organizing and other kinds of civil society strategies and practices. And through that, I think one of the arguments that is important for us is to acknowledge the agency that these civil society actors do have, not just kind of responding to institutional changes, but even in constrained settings, also contributing to kind of informing or changing civic spaces, even in a situation where it may seem quite challenging and difficult. So with some of these more kind of informal or mundane interactions that we also sought to make visible through this project. And I think that a lot of the chapters that you now will be presented with show that in different ways and have their kind of various perspectives and approaches to our agenda. I just want to end by saying that all the authors were given 3 questions that has kind of structured the project. One is to specify the characteristics of the civil society actors. We wanted them explicitly to explore and analyze the context that they thought of as constraining or enabling civil society action. And we also asked them to analyze in the different ways, or the multiple ways that civil society responded to various changes in their environments. And hopefully you will get some little tastes of that in the chapter contributions. But before we come to the chapters, I will leave it to Kees to say a little bit more about the general findings and discussions, or concluding discussions of the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Yes, let me start by saying a few words about the map that we project here of the Civic Monitor. And you'll probably all know it, the Civic Monitor of Civic Space, which gives points to the level in which it is open or totally closed. And obviously, the red is totally closed. And if you look at it, there's very few green. And I think even in, let's say, the global north, you will see very few, actually a minority of countries that are totally open. And I think that illustrates a little bit the context that we have read in the chapters. I mean, there's a lot to say about this civic space monitor, but it's the only thing that is actually available that is dynamic. It's changing every day, and I recommend you to sort of have a look at it if you haven't seen it before. But it's one of the few sort of monitors that is available of civic space. Now, so as Marianne said, the first question was actually to look at the context in which the various civic actors were operating in relation to the changing civic spaces. And of course, the big international context is a context of crisis, war in Ukraine in the period that we were editing the book, but also the pandemic. This product is also a product of the pandemic, where we have seen a lot of constraints happening in civil society, but also actually a lot of opportunities in terms of solidarity actions, especially at the local level, and maybe less spectacular sort of social mobilizations, even though they started to re-emerge after the end of the pandemic. Now, the other sort of major sort of contextual commonality that we've seen is the strengthening of right-wing populist movements and leaders, and the sensation that many of those are there to stay. They have started to transform structures in such a way that it is difficult to get rid of them. And I think that is sort of globally affecting lots of the discussions. And then this international trend towards autocratization, as Marianne was saying, this increased authoritarianism has disrupted a lot of states' citizens' relationships. So you can say that the whole concept of liberal democracy is threatened worldwide, and democratization processes are slowing down, and in some cases they are reversed or threatened to be reversed, if we may include the Dutch actual situation. So what all authors in the volume sort of identify and observe is the consequences of all these sort of crises is a drastic change in civic space. And of course, we have to identify here that largely the civic space for progressive civil society organization is being reduced, and in some cases, for more right-wing populist movements, is expanded. And hence our choice also to talk about changing civic spaces rather than what is common to talk about only shrinking civic spaces, because that is sort of the perspective that you look at. Now, the second question was to look how different approaches of civic space and changing civic space have been identified in the various chapters of the book. And there we found that there is no total consensus about how to look at civic space. There's also not a lot of difference, but there's slight differences. So we found interesting sort of distinctions, and we identified 4 different ways in which civic space was used. The most common and the most widely used is the one that civic space is identified as an arena for the established civil society organizations to engage with human rights advocacy, lobbying, but also an arena which individuals, citizens, and informal groups, also at local level, can act to address important issues for them. So that's sort of the most common one. The second one is the concept of humanitarian space, which is very much linked to humanitarian action and shaped by a negotiation of many actors involved in the humanitarian aid chain, which is quite a specific part of civic space, and therefore it's called humanitarian space, but there's linkages, which is worked out by Hilhorst and Janssen in their chapter. So, and then we have this element of civic space, which is understood as a set of policies, of laws, of institutions, practices, in which particular groups can express, associate, assemble, So that is very much sort of probably a bit wider because it includes also laws, institutions, practices. And then the fourth one is the most specific. It looks at civic space within specific sectors of civil society, such as women's organizations, but also peace movements, which is identified by several authors in the book. But taken together, you can still say that these conceptualizations of civic space are not really contradicting each other. They're all sort of specifications of the same idea, which probably was articulated clearest by Civicus as the place, physical, virtual, legal, where people exercise their rights to freedom of association, freedom of expression, and freedom of peaceful assembly. These three sort of citizenship freedoms are also central in the map that you see in terms of indicators. So all authors are agreeing, and we'll hear more examples of the specific authors, that civic space worldwide, wherever you look, is changing and is very dynamic. And so the colors may also change quickly again, if you look at the map. But largely we also see that after a period of democratic gains, we are entering a period of democratic reversal in which civic space is increasing for right-wing populist organizations in civil society. So the third area of inquiry for the chapters was what are the responses of and who are sort of the actors from civil society responding to these changing civic spaces. And there we identified a whole range of different organizations, community organizations, more sort of loose streets, protests, women's movement, women's initiatives. We have this very interesting case of artist intervention, and René Spitz will talk about that in the context of Algeria a bit later. But also donor-funded NGOs, some organizations that have been co-opted by regime. Margriet will speak about advocacy and lobbying organizations that have sort of tried to respond to this reduced space for civil society organizations. So there was a whole range of different organizations that we identified there. And of course, that's the choice of our case studies and our chapters that has determined this pattern. And there we do see possibilities for new and follow-up research to expand that. It's a very rich area, which is recently sort of developed to look at that in relation to civic space. So basically the conclusions are that the outcome of these changing civic spaces at the moment are unclear. We are sort of asking the question, should we be hopeful? And that's what we sort of develop in the last chapter of the book. Or should we actually be desperate how this will further develop? And on one hand, we see the diversified ways in which civil society is responding to the reduction of these civic freedoms. And we sort of may have some optimism that this will sort of have an effect. And we have seen reversal of the democratic reversal. Look at Brazil, and Patricia will speak about that in a minute as well. On the other hand, we see the many instances worldwide of civic freedoms being constrained, of shrinking civic spaces. And that may sort of not be a reason for a lot of hope. The glimmers that we see of hope, the perspectives that we see, is that even in those periods, for example, of the pandemic, where everything was closed, I mean, the physical space was closed, there was a lot of solidarity practice. So there was a lot of what we call latent civic agency coming up that was in a way very promising. And the other element that is maybe hopeful is that we also have seen, despite a lot of, or as a result of a lot of reduction of international donor funding, we see a lot of local civil society organizations being creative and looking for alternatives, and also reducing international dependencies on the more traditional aid formats. So that is important. And at the same time, we see in those very tight sort of authoritarian settings, also people standing up, maybe not large movements, but they are responding, including the bigger countries like Russia, China, Turkey, etc., where we do see something happening in terms of civil society response. So we recognize that our volume is particular. We don't have the ambition to cover everything, but we hope we have inspired others also to work further and develop further on monitoring the process that we have identified. So I'd like now to move and give the floor to some of the individual chapter authors who have looked at very particular national circumstances. So over to you, Tiina.
Okay, thank you, Marianne and Kees, for the great introduction. And I'm sure that we can come back to the discussion about the hope and desperation in the question and answers session. So in this book, we have 11 empirical chapters from different perspectives and different contexts. And of course, unfortunately, we cannot go through them all in this session. And I would like to encourage everyone to have a look at the book. It's on open access and everybody can upload it free from Springer. But without further ado, we have 4 exciting examples of our chapters. And I would first like to invite Mark van Wessel, who is an associate professor at the Strategic Communication Chair Group at Wageningen University and Research, the Netherlands. And her research centers on civil society advocacy, civil society collaboration, and focuses on voice representation and communication and power. And of course, related interest is in advocacy evaluation. And today she will speak about the chapter on advocacy in constrained settings. So, floor is yours, Mark, please.
Sorry about this. I have to find my way across my materials. Yeah, so thanks so much, Tiina and everybody for having me. We were asked to provide a picture as illustration. Now, this is my picture. I'm sure everybody recognizes this. If you go to the shop and you try to buy Christmas lights, it all looks very nice and neat in a box. And after the first encounter, you learn that actually Christmas lighting looks like this. It will always look like this from the first encounter onwards, basically. But there's this shiny box that you start with, and you think that you're going to deal with that all along. But that's not the truth of it. Now, what I see with civil society, and this is where the analogy comes in, I've looked at the way that the INGO world has responded to the question of civic space. And then I see there's not much of a response in the way that advocacy is actually approached. The shiny box with everything neat and tidy is largely maintained. Of course, there are recognitions of limits to civic space, but at the same time, guidelines and approaches for advocacy remain largely the same. There is the assumption of a liberal state, of there being a government that is able to take decisions, is able to follow up on these decisions, implement these, have legitimacy to do those things, and that civil society can play an autonomous role engaging the state. So there's something to advocate for, and there is a legitimate and stable target, and you can actually create change through that advocacy. So this whole set of assumptions on the liberal state is kind of applied worldwide, like it's universally applicable. Now, I looked at how advocacy in the context of constrained setting, that is, I looked at fragile context and authoritarian context, how that compares to these assumptions of the liberal state. How is advocacy actually different? And then what you see is that there are quite important limitations to autonomy a lot of the time. There are key challenges that are coming up with that for advocacy organizations that are never really discussed in any open way in the NGO business. It's like the same picture of we have everything under control and we can do this, and advocacy is possible and worth supporting, and without any issues regarding those questions of autonomy, for example, that doesn't come in. So what I think is then this is not doing justice to the true situation of advocacy, but it's also not doing justice to the actual true skills and knowledge and efforts and courage of organizations doing advocacy in these constrained settings. And that too requires a lot more of our attention. So what I do in my chapters is I show that there are these assumptions in the way that NGOs and donors approach advocacy. So I bring out how the assumptions on the liberal state actually come in there, for example, around autonomy. And then I show that these problems to actually work autonomously and influence policy from that position come in authoritarian and fragile context. So I'm very grateful to people who have done research on that. I used a lot of that. For fragile settings, there's not a lot of research there, and I think it's really important that we do more of that, because many advocacy organizations work in fragile settings, are also supported by the donor world, by NGOs here in the global north, for example, here in Europe. And those are largely not engaging with the specific nature of advocacy in constrained settings at all. So I think there's a world to be gained there. And I provide some reflections at the end of the chapter on 4 aspects that I think the donor world and big NGOs should actually think about and develop policies on. For example, what could be appropriate policies for civil society organizations and allies and donors for handling constraints and approaching possibilities considering constraints on autonomy? For example, what do you do with organizations that are acting as allies to one or the other power, that are embedded in party politics, that are not able to maintain their autonomy, that are co-opted for a part, that are handling the limits like that in a strategic way while allowing for co-optation, while also, for example, still seeking to address at least some of the issues that they want to work on within such a setting. What are our standards for that? What are the conditions for supporting advocacy in constrained settings? And then what capacities actually do we need to stimulate and encourage and distinguish? For example, the capacity to gain and maintain support from power holders in situations where that power is distributed or unstable without being fully co-opted. How about the capacity to combine service delivery and advocacy, as it often happens in constrained settings, to build legitimacy, but also to build a position from which advocacy can actually happen? So capacities can be different in these constrained settings. And how about recognizing those as donors and NGOs? And how about strategies, understanding strategies as contextually, emerging contextually? So, for example, how to relate to diverse power holders, how to build a legitimate position, or navigate and use distribution in power. For example, usage of diverse entry points, like in a condition of constrained civic space, you may not be able to go in at one level, but you may be able to go in at a lower level. How about recognizing strategy that works within such constraints, rather than expecting national level advocacy to be of primary importance, because that's where the big gains are to be had? So that such recognition and understanding of strategies as contextually specific. And then management of risk. So the risks of co-optation, the risk to integrity, the risk to survival, risks regarding data management, maneuvering around funds in a way that overcomes funding limits in conditions of constrained civic space. Such risks are really important, and management of such risks is also really important. So these four aspects of dealing with the constraints and possibilities of advocacy in constrained settings, I think, are really important for INGOs and donors to recognize, to have conversations on, and develop policies on, which is what I have not seen happening thus far. And yeah, that's my call, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Margit. Very, very to the point presentation. Next, I would like to invite Patricia. Thanks for finding time to join us today. So Patricia Maria Mendonça is an associate professor at the University of Sao Paulo School of Arts, Sciences and Humanities in Brazil. She teaches in undergraduate and master courses in public policy and management, and also works on the themes of civil society organizations and their relations with the state. So Patricia, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tiina. Hello, everyone. As you see in the picture, my topic to this book is related to philanthropy in Brazil. I wrote this chapter together with two co-authors, Cássio Aoki and Letícia Cardoso. They are both practitioners and also involved in some academic projects. And so today I'm telling you a little bit about our research. But first, I have to tell you that during we did this study during the pandemic. During the pandemic, we had a negationist government that was made our life very difficult during to deal with the health issues related to that. During the pandemic, the map that the editors showed you before, it was yellow. It means that the context, the civic space was considered obstructed. No, I had a look today, and they just updated it. It's now green in Brazil. But we have a neighbor, Argentina, that now is just elected a right-wing populist president. So, and things are still here, not because we have changed our political representatives that this wave, of conservative civil society and populist ideas are still there. So I'm going to talk about philanthropy during this period of pandemic. And just previous to the pandemic, civil society in Brazil had also experienced a period of difficulty in raising money, because money from international donors, mostly northern donors, had diminished a lot. No, it was, and specifically to NGOs doing advocacy or working with the rights of vulnerable populations. So this was a problem still in Brazil. No? And so they started to look at other possibilities to raise funds, basically local philanthropy. Brazil is a very big country with a very big market. So we have like economic elites that are able to have this role of being, philanthropists here. The problem is that this political and economic elite, they are engaged in philanthropy, since the beginning of Brazil as linked to religion, the Catholic Church, and then other religions, almost as a colonial project, colonial sense of the, not in the sense of the power, the post-colonialism discourse, but as really a colonial power project. So philanthropy was linked to that. And so this philanthropy is then after the independence of Brazil and when Brazil turned into a republic, it started to embrace another project, a liberal project, and it was very much connected to charity and that. So they were not interested in founding, progressive civil society and to deal with advocacy and things like that. But things started to change a little bit, with some of them now investing in entrepreneurship and starting to, look at specific vulnerable people, identities. But what happened during the pandemic, we had a very big increase in the amount of donations by different actors, including individuals, and they started to change their practices, because the local experiences, we are studying local experience in urban peripheries in big cities in Brazil during the pandemic. They were there, they were working with field research, doing like a silent job. But during the pandemic, because of their needs, to deal with we closed the economy and everything, they started to use information and communication technologies, for example, in new ways, not only for personal communications, for personal use, but to help collective action, and also to as a broadcast for the things they were doing in their territories, in the things they are doing in their way. They were mobilizing to distribute food baskets, to help people in vulnerable situations, to register in the internet for the government support that was given to vulnerable people during the pandemic. And they started to show these traditional philanthropists new ways of possibilities of grant groups, even informal groups. So there were many innovations into that, because they were listened to. People started to pay attention to what these informal groups in peripheries, mothers, and other people in these urban territories, they were doing. And they, because of the situation of emergency, they started to do these experimentations, because there was no other way to do that, to make the money to reach people that were really needed during the pandemic. So, and we saw a lot of that, a kind of ideas coming from the communities to these philanthropists and also to intermediaries of new ways of working with that. That was very, we asked ourselves if it was a post-colonial way of doing philanthropy. In some cases, this type of relationships, they remain after the pandemics, but in other ways, it started to go to the as it was before, a very formal relationships, very bureaucratic. But in other ways, they started to pay attention for these new possibilities of having different dialogues based more on trust and less on bureaucratic control. And I think these are interesting ideas, to leave with you for our debate. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Patricia, so much. So now, after advocacy and philanthropy, we will then shift to something else related to civil society, civic space. So I would like to invite René Spitz, who obtained his PhD at Leiden University, the Netherlands, and his academic work focuses on state civil society relations in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And in addition, he has more than 30 years of work experience with the Netherlands Ministry for Foreign Affairs and largely in the MENA region. So, René, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tiina, and hi, everybody. I see a picture of a demonstration and it's the big one, which took place in 2019 and 2020 in Algeria, locally called the Hirak. Yeah, translated would be the movement. Well, I would like to tell a little bit about the context in which this social political movement developed, and yeah, its demands, its characteristics. But before going into it, I would like also to tell that that in the current situation, yeah, the picture is quite grim. For instance, I could give a quote now from Merouk Touati. He is an editor of the Al Hogra newspaper. He wrote in November 2023, so very recently. His quote is, the Algerian people broke down the wall of fear. The regime has more or less succeeded in rebuilding it. So the wall of fear was broken down in 2019. Yeah, and after that, a number of developments took place, which enabled the regime to take control once again of the situation. So it is, so my contribution is about civil society in a context of being under pressure. And yeah, I would like to tell a little bit about how civil society, this civil society movement, managed to enlarge public and civic space. And in this context, how the artists contributed to the Hirak. And Hirak is often quoted in the, by journalists and by others as the revolution with a smile. So I want to focus a little bit on what made it a revolution with a smile. But first thing, I should stress that also because I stayed for a couple of years in Algeria, I had really the impression before, let's say, the time of the Hirak, that civil society in Algeria was present, but it could only, and to a very limited way, express sensitive issues, in the sense issues that would be considered as be threatening to those who are in power. And that in the domain of culture, I should also indicate that there was a development that at least artists within this domain of culture could touch upon some of these social and politically sensitive issues, but this was remained in a constrained context. What made the momentum that artists could contribute also to this wider movement called the Hirak? Well, actually, this was the prospect of having for a fifth time, President Bouteflika, who was at that time in 2014 already in his fourth term, and in 2019 he would start his fifth term. But already in 2014 he was victim of a stroke, so he was paralyzed. So a lot of people were wondering who is actually running our country. And in the Algerian context, many analysts use the term le pouvoir, which is actually means something like those who are in power. and it refers to the military, of people within the military, I should say, within the security services, within certain political parties, some people with who were entrepreneurs, people of the family of Bouteflika. So they all made, in one or other way, a rather obscure system of people running the country. Very unclear for those who try to observe what's going on, who was actually in the lead. So in this context, people from different local organizations were actually spearheading a movement which grew and grew through weekly meetings and demonstrations in all major cities, and that went on for more than 1 year. And the characteristics of this movement were, first of all, its peacefulness, the involvement of many young people, many women, people from different ethnic and linguistic groups. Yeah, you can see it also a little bit in the picture, although I haven't shown a picture with also Tamazight language, the Berber language, but these slogans were on the street, while the Tamazight people in Algeria have a complicated relationship, let's say it in this way, with those who are in power, although there are presently more possibilities to express themselves in their language. The messages from people at that moment, besides that they were fed up with the prospect of having a fifth term, was especially the suffering they felt, the fact that so many young people tried in an illegal way to leave the country, which they call harga, the injustice they felt from the side of the authorities, so the word hogra, and they were calling for dignity. So the movement was very broad. They were also in the way of expressing themselves, and now I come here to the role of the artists. The artists were very much involved in the movement. I'm not saying that the artists in a collective way, but individuals in and outside of the country, they contributed through music, through slogans, through poems, through novels, in a very different way. They participated in discussions with those who were demonstrating. So they played a role, and they suffered also the moment that the authorities tried to regain control. So this regaining control over this movement, this was a long process, and it took place in a context in 2020 where the corona measures were implemented, and also people in the lead of these weekly demonstrations, they communicated to their followers that for the moment it was better not to have these mass meetings. So in the meantime, also within the regime under pressure, some reforms have taken place. Some people who were in the lead in the government were replaced. Elections were promised. Bouteflika, he resigned in the meantime. But there was also a process of cooptation among the people involved in the protests, or giving within certain political parties, giving some support. And last but not least, repression increased, and actually the authorities embraced the first part of the first, let's say, requests of the Iraq movement. So by changing the government, promising elections, they try to embrace the requests of the people. And then once they had the feeling that they were in control, they gave the message that any new demonstrations would be repressed. And so from the point of view of legislation, but also from the practical point of view, the Iraq was very much under pressure. And coming back to the first quote with which I started, so the wall around civil society, and especially the wall around using civic space, was once again raised. So for me, it was important to see that in a country where I thought there is no space really in the public sphere to express yourself, but underneath there were still developments which in society which led people to organize, and which came forward the moment there was something which an event around which people could organize themselves. And and then the other part of the picture is also that people with very different backgrounds could find themselves to discuss in what way, in this case in Algeria, state-society relations should develop.
Okay.
This is more or less what I, for the moment, want to share. If there is any need to go a little bit more into what kind of specific activities of artists play the role in these demonstrations, then I'm ready to give some comment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and of course, very important chapter. And please have a look at the chapter, and we can maybe come back to the discussion. But let's move forward now in order to also hear from a kind of, again, an alternative perspective to civil society. Our next presenter is Katiuska Galliera, and she's a postdoctoral researcher in Universidade Estadual Paulista, Marília, in Brazil. And her areas of specializations are gender, labor, social movements, and transnational corporations, global supply chains, and Latin American political economy. And now we will hear something about the civil society and supply chains. Unfortunately, Katiuska, taking her research interest, she needed to go to a meeting with social movements today, but she was kind enough to send us a video with the presentation. So let's hear from her as a recorded presentation.
So I'm just gonna have to stop sharing my screen for a second so I can share the video. Let me know if there are any issues with the audio.
Yeah, definitely.
Hello, everyone. I'm Katiuska Galliera, a postdoc researcher at the São Paulo State University Faculty of Philosophy and Sciences, Campus Marília. The following presentation is the result of a research from the International Institute of Social Sciences, part of Erasmus University Rotterdam, co-authors from the chapter entitled The Changing Civic Space Where Soy Meets Resistance, Arlie Pegler, Marcel Hazel, Juliana Sena, and Solange Gaioso. The research is based on 2 case studies at the Pará State, Brazil. The first one is Lower Tocantins, Barcarena, and Abaetetuba, and the second one is Lower Tapajós, Santarém, Itaituba and Mirituba, in a context of expansion of soy production in the whole country, Brazil, and in the Amazonian region in particular. It's worth noting that Brazil has been gone through a boom of agricultural commodities and has been to specializing in the production of soybeans for exports, including the Amazon area of Pará state. By the mid-90s, that soy reached the Brazilian Amazon and allowed the establishment of private ports in the country and the operation of third-party cargoes. Between 2014 and 2020, the volume of soybeans exported grew in 7 ports, all of them located in the Amazon region. In these extensive areas of soybean plantation, traditional communities strongly linked to their livelihoods and people such as indigenous and black communities used to live off diversified agricultural production and forest areas with fruits, roots, wild fauna, and domesticated animals. However, a structural result of this agrarian transformation from the commodities includes monocultural landscapes for the production of soybeans on an industrial scale to the detriment of family and peasant agriculture. It means that the territorialization by these companies and soybean producers came at the cost of the territorialization of peoples and communities for the degradation of the areas they live at, making impossible a life with dignity and health, because with the newcomers and the logistical structures of the soil, land grabbing, land concentration, social inequality, deforestation, pollution, water exhaustion, erosion of biodiversity, and many other forms of violence popped up in the region. However, resistance exists as a counterpoint to the power of landowners and multinational corporations. The repertoires of action include direct action, discourse and focus on the environment, legal battles, protests, community councils, support from universities and NGOs, and the role of the public prosecutors of to administrate illegalities from multinationals. Central to communities has been the Convention 169 from the International Labour Organization. Since 1989, the Statement of Rights codified by the Convention has also been progressively incorporated into the resistance repertoires as a way of recognizing and maintaining such livelihoods. The Convention is a useful and important rallying tool for voice and action against the impacts of the power and of multinationals. Despite context-based hierarchies of power, there is evidence that some groups are developing the core of what might be called a social movement. Their opponents are easily identifiable, and their repertoires of contention often go beyond just politics to issues of material, social, and cultural significance. The use of the convention and consultation protocols by traditional communities constitutes strategies within historical processes of existence as a standpoint in the face of state colonization and capital accumulation. The 2 case studies I mentioned show that engagement with Amazonian civic space is quite heterogeneous. At times, prominent local protagonists and a few international NGOs have been an anti-Chan view. At other times, local NGOs focus on the environment or on indigenous farmer fishermen rights. Various agencies of the state provide zoning and technical advice and sometimes also support. These networks' responses themselves also vary per local context. It is not the emergence of a new civic space, but a new form of struggle using civic weapons within constrained settings. The use of Convention 169 is an issue of legal, juridical, and political instrument that was created in a spirit of participation and via international pressure on behalf of traditional communities. It has occasionally opened within the limits and contradictions of each territory for participation, autonomy, and resistance. The basis of traditional community struggles remain the same or are even strengthened and become more evident, being their collective identities, way of living, occupation, and traditional use of the territory. As with all instruments and strategies, in the case studied here, these tools are situated within complex and contradictory fields of interest, where the state, through legislation, policy, and judicial decisions, interferes and is present. This is all. Thank you very much for the opportunity of talking to you.
Okay, thanks for Katiuska, and sorry for the some technical problems with the picture, but we could hear very well the presentation. And again, I encourage everyone to have a look at the chapter. At this point, I would like to warmly thank all our chapter contributors for very interesting and to-the-point presentations of their chapters. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of all the whole editorial team that it has been really a pleasure to work with all the authors during this process. But the discussion goes on, and I next would like to welcome Professor Nick Cheeseman. And he's a professor of democracy in international development and also founding director of the Center for Elections, Democracy, Accountability and Representation at the University of Birmingham. He has published extensively on democracy, elections and development, and has conducted in-country research in a range of African countries, as well as published on Latin America and post-communist Europe. So he is really well-equipped person to have a critical commentary on the books that have different contexts and different kind of viewpoints to the authoritarianization in different contexts. And as we can see, he has also recently published an article about defending civic space. So with this word, I would like to invite Nick to comment.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I'd just like to congratulate the editors and the authors on a really important publication and a great job today presenting it. The first thing I have to say to everyone on the call who hasn't yet read all of this material is that you should go and do so, because it's fabulous. And there's a lot of rich material here, some of which has been presented very well in the comments and discussion so far, but it's far richer than that. There's only so much you can do in the short time allocated. So I would encourage everyone to go and download the materials and read them very carefully. A couple of things I really liked about this. One, that a lot of the work here is not simply through the lens of donors and aid. It's things like philanthropy, agency of organizations, and so on. I think that's really refreshing and very important. I think it's important for two reasons. One, we often overlook that side of it, sadly, but also two, in an increasingly constrained environment where donors may find it harder to provide funding for NGOs in future, that kind of approach is actually in many ways pointing us towards the answer and the solutions to some of the challenges that we see. I also like, that, as I say, that focus on agency and the role of civil society in our own work, the piece that's highlighted there in the picture. One of the points we demonstrate is it's really the capacity and agency of civil society groups on the ground to react to repressive legislation in ways that are proactive and creative and in which they lead rather than external powers lead, is really one of the critical factors that determines their success or not. So I think that's another really important feature of these chapters. So I don't have anything, as it were, massively critical to say, because I actually think this is great and really valuable work. But I do have a few questions I thought I might put to the editors and the authors that I think cut across some of their work and connect it to mine and connect it very much to that question at the beginning of closing civic space. And perhaps sort of encouraging you to put sort of finer points or details and sharpen up the conclusion in terms of where you see the overall kind of project, falling. So, one of the things that I think seems to be the case is that, we're in a situation where we've seen vast numbers of countries pass, anti-NGO legislation, anti-civic legislation of one form or another. A lot of that has been explicitly designed to restrict international funding. And sadly, one of the things that we've seen, I think, over the last couple of years is increasing evidence that one of the things that leads to restrictions on civil society groups is actually increases in donor funding. So cases where donors have deliberately pulled money out of budget support and then pushed it into civil society because of democratic backsliding and a desire not to be seen to be directly funding governments, has often then constructed civil society as almost the enemy of the state and therefore emboldened the state to crack down on civil society. Tunisia right now is a great example of that, but there's many others. So one question I kind of had here is, what should donors do to respond? Should they simply try and move out of some of this space and fund less civil society as a way of avoiding civil society being criticized as, an international actor, as a pawn of the international community? Or are there alternative ways that international donors can provide funding that don't put the organizations they fund at the same kind of risk? And what might those new modalities of support be? Is it feasible, for example, that domestic sources of funding could be strengthened in order to create a more powerful and more resistant set of organizations to infringements on international funding networks? So, for example, I used to sit on the board of Oxfam. One of the things that Oxfam was really looking at doing was, the localization agenda, pushing more of its money and more of its unrestricted funding to NGOs and civil society groups in the global south so that they could decide what to do with that funding. Are there strategies like that that could perhaps be used that, are lower profile ways of trying to transfer resources and don't involve donors and therefore protect civil society groups a little bit from being seen to be doing the dirty work of the international community? Second question I had is related to kind of how donors might want to move forwards in the future, which is about, the question of whether or not donors should be funding sort of formal professional civil society groups, or whether or not in the current context it would be better to fund social movements and how that might happen. And I think one of the things that I found really interesting in conversations I've had with social movement leaders is that many of them are quite reluctant to accept donor funding, partly because they don't want to be tainted with the brush of being supported by the international community, partly because many of them are actually very critical of established traditional civil society NGOs. They see them as being located in capital cities, locked in bricks and mortar institutions, relatively slow to respond. In some cases, they criticize them for being, overly reliant on government or international contracts there to pick up salaries rather than to affect significant change. And so they're quite reluctant to accept that funding. So one of the things that I do wonder about at the minute is whether or not there's a disconnect in many countries between traditional donor-funded NGO civil society sector and the social movements that are emerging around that, and whether or not that creates a kind of potential weakness that we could work towards strengthening over the next 10, 15 years. And more broadly, I wonder, how do you change and channel that social movement energy into something that perhaps is a bit more sustainable and a bit less vulnerable to subversion? Of course, one of the things that social movement leaders often point out is that the more we make them formalize their social movements, for example, in order to receive donor funding, the easier it is for them to be targeted. My other final two questions are, about how civil society is in two different dimensions. So the first is that, of course, as a couple of you have said, civil society is often co-opted or forced to be co-opted into government networks. And I think one of the challenges that we sometimes have is that civil society itself has at times been the problem. A very good example being, the kind of faith-based organizations that were supported by many countries around the world to do things like deliver services were recently implicated in promoting anti-homosexuality legislation across Africa. And so there's a kind of question mark here about how civil society really is, both in terms of whether or not it gets forced to become a partisan actor in deeply authoritarian states like Rwanda, but also in terms of whether it fully upholds a full set of liberal rights and values. And I'd be interested in perspectives here of what, you know, our approach should be to that. Should we simply be supportive of organizations that do good work in some areas, even if they do deeply problematic work in others? How do we think about that much more complex reality? And the final thing I wanted to put on the table, which isn't really in the book, but is something that a lot of NGOs and civil society groups, you know, have been talking to me about, is, you know, what's justified in a context in which there's increasing authoritarianism in so many states in the world, in which governments are repressing civil society groups and preventing them from doing things like peaceful protests. What are the kind of routes that are then justified? Is civil disobedience in a non-violent way still the only thing that we want to endorse and encourage? Are there ever cases when the use of violence may be acceptable? Think about somewhere like Myanmar, for example, where it seems like there's an increasing fusion between the initial non-violent protest of civilians against the military junta and the kind of civil, the conflict groups, the violence rebels groups around the periphery of the country, as a result of the military's refusal to allow for democratic peaceful protest and its decision to continually fire on protesters. And I wonder whether, you know, some of the kind of nice kind of liberal values and assumptions we've made about civil society that I think you started talking about at the very beginning are increasingly being challenged because organizations are no longer working in environments in which it's feasible to operate in that way. And I wonder, you know, what we say and how we think about responding to organizations that face that particularly significant challenge. So to summarize, fantastic papers, fantastic project. We need a lot more work like this. This is a fantastic start, but I hope we see a lot more. Really great chapters with a lot of rich material, and I would encourage people to go and read those. And I'd really love to see a discussion here about how can the sort of international groups and partners in the room, you know, avoid doing harm to civil society. What's the best way to sort of harness some of the great strengths that are coming out of things like social movements? And how do we actually think about the fact that civil society might not be so civil and might be starting to adopt, you know, non-civil strategies in response to the democratic backsliding we've seen over the last 20 years. But thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nick, for the comments, and of course, very, very exciting questions and used questions. That maybe, Sarah, we can now start. Stop sharing the presentation so that we can see each other's. Okay, there was a lot of questions and lot of kind of openings for new discussions for the authors and editors, but I also would like to encourage everyone in the room, supposedly having a lot of experience and ideas about these questions to contribute through the chat function. But first, would any one of the authors or Kees or Marianne to respond to some of those questions Nick posed? Margaret, please.
Yes, thanks so much, Nick, for those fantastic, compliments, and also the very interesting and relevant issues that you raise. I would just like to take up one of them that has to do with the role of donors, because that's also a little bit what my chapter addresses. Should donors pull out of civic space because of the accusation of that are leveled at civil society to being supported by the internationals and therefore not legitimate. Well, what I see in different settings, and especially India, where I've been working, is that the state levels all kinds of accusations at civil society to legitimize. If it's not being in foreign hands, a foreign agent, is something else, right? It's a rhetorical strategy, and if it's not that, then they have other ways to do it, because the objective is to delegitimize, it's not the objective factor, I think, of foreign funding. Foreign funding is also very welcome if it's used in a way that supports the legitimacy of the state. So I think it's good to be careful with pulling out, also because then they have you exactly where they want you, right? You're doing what they're hoping you to do. I think it would be very good to actually engage with civil society organizations in the Global South who are facing these accusations also, to see what they would think would be viable strategies around that. And I see organizations carefully manipulating these constrictions on funding that they get, for example, to register not as a civil society organization, but to but as a social enterprise by which they can function as a business, for example. There's also the question of supporting social movements or NGOs, right? What I see happening in India is organizations working along lines of having different platforms at the same time to manage visibility. So social movement could be supported by NGOs indirectly to decrease visibility problems, but also to support social movements in ways that capitalize on NGO strengths and contribute to the efforts of civil society. For example, given the problems that civil society, well, social movements often have with monitoring the state, engaging with international policy arenas, etc. Helping social movements understand how to engage with policy, for example, such things I think could also be really helpful. And there's lots of creative strategies around things like that, like you also said. And I think donors could really look up much more closely what the perspectives are of civil society organizations working in constrained settings to adjust their strategy, which is also, I think, an expansion of my argument earlier on and in the chapter. Thanks.
Yeah, Kees. You are muted.
Thank you very much, Margit, and also thanks, Nick, for your critical comments and your questions. I'd just like to follow up on Margit. Even though I largely agree with your suggestions, Margit, I think there is also something that we've seen during the production of this volume that seems to be rather irreversible, and I think that is that the backsliding of international funding for civil society organizations, or the reduction generally, is not going to be reversed. I mean, it is clear from all sort of settings that this is sort of a practice that is running out, or at least changing in such a way that the financial element of it is becoming less prominent and less important. And I agree with you, the informational one, the networking element, is therefore becoming more and more important. So sort of building also on Patricia's experience of the philanthropy solidarity during COVID, I think there we see sort of elements of what potentially a future will look like, which is basically the mobilization of local resources at different levels, both sort of community as well as higher levels, which is all other resources, which is inevitably going to be necessary for running particular organizations. I very much agree with you, and others said it as well. You have to be extremely careful in financing social movements, because you very quickly NGO-inize them, and they become institutions, and you just undermine them. There's so many examples also from research that financing social movements equals killing social movements, which does not mean that you have to have some sort of support network around them, which is very important. Now, I think one of the big questions, and for me that is sort of a potential follow-up volume, how can this local support system that was for many years sort of supported, for many decades, supported also by international aid, international NGOs. Nick was mentioning Oxfam. this is gradually sort of phasing out. What is going to replace it? That is for me a very big question. And can we build on practices like the one that we've seen in Brazil, or the one that we've also seen in many African countries in terms of community philanthropy, for example, or other formats of more sort of market-based income generation strategies that is also used? Can't we sort of look more in those directions? So I'm just opening this also up as a perspective and as a question.
Patricia, please.
Yeah, I agree with Kees that the traditional form of flowing support, financial support from North organizations, from the Northern world, to the South, Global South, using traditional Global South NGOs. These organizations here are facing very big problems, because these organizations, they tend to support a network of social movements or grassroots organizations, but they tend also to operate their own platforms of advocacy or even service delivery. And these type of organizations here are very, they could not find other ways of getting funded. So many of them are still funded by international donors, mainly by international donors, but they still have some big problems. For example, every 3 years, the Association of Brazilian NGOs, ABONG here, it does a census of their members. And for example, one of their problems that they cannot find a way of having NGO leaders that are not white men. While these grassroots organizations that take forms that are not similar to these NGOs, that are sometimes informal, they are claiming for that, or let's be representative, because if you want to work with Black women in the urban peripheries, and these organizations, they don't accept, they don't put them on the leadership positions, this type of people, what kind of impact do you have? So they are being very much questioned here. And there are, for a while, there are other types of intermediaries that are and now we can see in Brazil. We cannot call them NGOs, but they're like funds, collective funds that take money for international donors, but they're basically intermediaries. They raise money to give small donations for this type of peripheral organizations, collective groups, even to individual activists. And they are, and sometimes they take the format of these intermediaries, sometimes they take the form of community foundations or community groups. So these traditional NGOs, there is a question here about the COP28, these international arenas. They are the ones that go to this place. But this place now are basically, they are commanded by companies. The leader of the COP28 now is the second CEO of an oil company. So this Global South voice, at least, they are not there in this international space. And I don't know how can we have their voice channeled in another way into this space. Otherwise, this space, I think they are going to get each time more irrelevant, because they don't reach any kind of solution for anything. It's just a performatic space.
Thank you, Patricia. I can see that we have already reached our time. Should we continue the discussion or close for today and see that there's a lot to discuss, and all the questions Nick posed are something that maybe require a lot of reflection and kind of thinking. There's one a question on the chat about the human rights-based approach, and that why didn't we explicitly use it in the book? So I don't know, would Marianne have a very short reflection on that why it wasn't the kind of the starting point of civics, the concept of civic space for our book?
Very quickly, I just now try to read the question as itself. I think that in the introduction, in part of the starting points, we address the issue of the kind of the rights-based legacies or trajectories of the civic space as a concept and as an idea. So we do kind of and how that human rights-based agenda has very much kind of framed and informed the way that civic space is being monitored and operationalized as a kind of tool to assess these democratic declines or shifts as Civicus is doing. So yes, it is there. Admittedly, not. I think it varies to the extent that it is used in the different chapters as a specific approach, and also in the introduction, I think that we also kind of problematizes it in a way, in the sense that what we try to do is also open this dynamic of seeing these dynamics beyond merely a human rights-based approach. And not saying that it's not important or relevant, but adding other ways of understanding these dynamics. I think that is also something that we try to tease out a little bit in the introduction. And I think maybe as a final reflection, I also want to thank Nick for his comments and very kind of challenging questions to answer on such a short notice. But I think that while I do not, I mean, I've recognized very well these tensions of social movements and NGOs from my South African kind of research and experiences. But I think that for us, when again, it's the same way as opening up this idea of what civic space is and how it changes and not in kind of the different contextual dynamics to it, is exactly to understand civil society as is and not nearly as kind of a normative kind of good notion of civil society. It doesn't, but it opens, of course, very difficult questions about how we then understand these, how we approach them, how we as researchers work with them. But I do think as researchers in understanding these dynamics, to acknowledge this politics of civil society, where there are also these spaces of other kinds of illiberal forces or non-democratic ideas, so something that we as kind of progressives would be reluctant to kind of support. It's still so important to understand the dynamics that is actually ongoing, if not as a research agenda as well. But it poses very challenging questions for us as researchers and people involved in development. Thanks.
Okay, Kees.
Yeah, very briefly. Very briefly, to also build on what Marianne says, I think here lies one of the follow-up tasks also for us as researchers. There is civil society internally is changing also. The balances are also changing. I was reading Marioka's question about how are we dealing with uncivil organizations within civil society. And I think it is going to be more and more relevant to address that question, whether we look at Hungary, whether we look at Russia or China, or whether we look at Argentina was mentioned already. I was in a discussion with Patricia a couple of months ago that the Argentinians were totally desperate. How are we going to stop, this new extreme populist sort of expression here, which was very difficult. And I think that is going to be a key question in the years to come, how to deal with those organizations that are not only sort of, let's say, supporting the backsliding and of democracy, but also undermining it actively. but they are also trying to implement changes that cannot be reversed. So in that sense, it is even more critical to address that and to deal with that and to study that. So I very much recommend and others sort of to pick this up and think how we can sort of make a follow-up. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mark, very brief comment, please.
Yeah, just very briefly, just a little bit of an illustration and expansion of what Kees was saying. In East Africa, movements for the LGBTQ plus groups, the rights of those groups are increasingly facing opposition from uncivil society, what we call uncivil society, what they themselves would not call in civil society, of course. With a big influence for certain churches that are also then again internationally supported, and this I think kind of underlines the need to keep an international perspective and to keep a view on the very dynamic and complex situation of civil society, and also engaging much more with the fact that civil society that we support faces a lot of opposition within and outside of the country. That's part of the dynamics that we have not looked at all from the development side. So I think that's another great research agenda aspect. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm afraid that we need to close for today, but it seems that we haven't answered all the questions. We haven't even reached the discussion on the questions. So I really hope the discussion will continue by all of us and in the form of different blogs and new research agendas. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us and giving your time. Thank you for all authors for also presenting your chapters, and thank you for the audience. And of course, thank you, EADI, for arranging this webinar and inviting us to do it.
Just one thing, Tiina, and the book is online, open access, available. Yeah, you don't have to pay a penny.
That's important. Yeah, so please go Google it, download it, and have a read. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.